market makes arbitrage difficult. You can have imperfect markets that are arbitrage-free, and you can have perfect markets that allow for arbitrage. Right? So the results and outcomes of these things are not kind of 100% identical. Finally, there are some other terms that markets are usually called, and I just want to kind of throw them in here. So there is the word complete market, and then there's the word efficient market. Again, these are different concepts, so we try to kind of distinguish them. Let's start with efficient markets. So efficient markets are about information. So does the price, for example, of a share reflect all the available information? So in an efficient market, for example, if there is a news about a company, you expect the share price to move immediately and reflect the news. If it's bad news, the share price should go down immediately. If kind of people have to read the newspaper on the next day, then make up their mind, and the share price moves 1 week later, that's an inefficient market, right? If the information is reflected immediately, it's efficient. If it's not reflected immediately, it's inefficient. So it's about information. And completeness is about basically whether the cash flows that exist in the economy are tradable, yes or no. Right? So you've looked at traded instruments like stocks and bonds, but there are other things like, for example, the cash flow from kind of renting out an apartment. Right? So that's a cash flow that you basically cannot trade. Well, you can buy the apartment, that's not something that's frequently traded, right? And there are other cash flows that might not be traded at all. Right? So our markets are inherently incomplete. So there's some cash flows that are not traded on the exchange that don't have a market price. The more illiquid a market is, the less complete it is. Right? So basic completeness is about, can you trade everything, every cash flow on an exchange, yes or no? And typically that's something that we basically do, and all the theories that you see here is that when we kind of write down cash flows, we're always able to kind of trade it and compute prices for it. But in real life, it's of course a little bit more complicated. So, and I noted this down here now that in the following, I always assume this context of perfect markets unless I explicitly note this otherwise. And by the way, like there's two terms for this. Either you can say perfect market or frictionless market. I actually prefer frictionless because it's a better description of what it is. Right? Doesn't mean everything's perfect in the market, but frictionless is basically saying that there are no things that make trading more difficult. But really, you can kind of find the analogy from physics, right? The friction is if two things are kind of rubbing at each other, it's creating heat and kind of energy loss, right? So friction is something where you lose money to, for example, the government or to the transaction costs. Okay. So let me see. So what's ahead is probably a little bit of a physical topic, and there is a little task in there. But I want you to do this as a homework. So let's maybe jump into the first slide. So I want to introduce a concept that is related to the law of one price, but it's a way of formalizing it. And this is actually quite an important example because it motivates what we're doing later on in the Cabal-Lesser pricing model. So the key intuition of the theories that we study should be clear from this example. So, and it's showing us the linkage between the present value method and the law of one price. And it's a special way of writing this down here, which was kind of developed by two guys called Arrow and Debreu. I think that was the doctoral thesis of Arrow, and he later got a Nobel Prize for it. So like he wrote this when he was 22 years old, so your age basically. So he was very young when he did his PhD. So what's the basic framework? So we are on the setting of uncertainty. That means I've put this down, or write this down here as a tree. So there are two scenarios that can happen, and you can call this good and a bad state for simplicity. Right? Good is, for example, when the economy is doing well, and bad is a recession. Or you could say the upper state is when the company is solvent and able to pay back its debt, and the bottom state is when the company is going bankrupt and cannot be able to pay back the debt. It's the most simple probability distribution that we have, right? It's two scenarios, and you can assume, for example, that it's a coin flip or any other probability for this. Now, so this is now an example actually of a complete market. So we have two scenarios, and the requirement that we have here is that the cash flows in each of those scenarios are traded independently. And we design a special type of security which is called a state price or elementary security. And they look like this. So these two securities here on the left are elementary securities or state price securities. Both names are fine. So this is a security here that pays you €1 in one of the scenarios and 0 in all other scenarios. And so this is the so-called state price or elementary security for the upstate. That's why there's the little u there. And pi is the price of the security. That's the Greek letter pi that's usually used as abbreviation. Right, but this here is a market price that you observe. And this is another security that pays you €1 in the bad scenario and 0 in the good scenario. So D for down here, and that has a price. So basically, you're now able to trade the cash flows in the respective scenarios. They're both occurring at the same time, but they're basically, when this one gives you €1, this one gives you 0, and other way around. So the scenarios are always the same, right? So all those securities that you see here end up either in the good or the bad state. They're not independent, so they're fully correlated. Right? So the first two things are called elementary securities. All right, so these are basically, first of all, definitions. There are a couple of things that we can say about the prices of these securities, because the prices, the cash flows from these products are never negative. It means that the prices should also be never negative. Right? So we can safely assume, otherwise you would have arbitrage feasible, that those two state prices that you observe here are positive. So state price now is the price of an elementary security. So this is a state price and this is a state price. Right? So the state price is the price of the security paying you €1 in the respective state or scenario. State price of the downstate is the price of the security paying you €1 in the downstate. So this is an example of a complete market because we have state prices for all possible scenarios. So if you have two scenarios, you need to have two state prices. If you have 5 scenarios, you need 5 state prices. As simple as it is. Right? So what's the advantage of knowing these state prices? And the advantage is that you can actually compute the value of any security that depends on the same source of uncertainty very quickly. Suppose you want to have a security that, just to give you an example, that pays you €5 in the upstate and €0 in the downstate. What shall be its price? Well, of course, the numbers are not here yet. That's part of your homework. But how can you relate it back to this price, to the state price? Suppose you observe this price and this price. So how can you relate this problem back to the state prices? So cash flow of 5 here and 0 there. We had this security. What should be its price?
So does that mean that if the market goes up, we'll be making 5 euros?
Yes.
And if the market goes down, it's 0.
Exactly. What will be the price of this security here?
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear it in the back. I'm sorry.
So, suppose you observe those two securities. They exist in the market. I've defined them for you. So this is an elementary security, this is an elementary security. These are the cash flows from the securities in the respective two scenarios. And the prices of these two securities are pi u and pi d, the so-called state prices. These will be numbers that we compute later on. Here's just the definition. Suppose you observe those two state prices. My claim is that you can compute the price of any cash flow that depends on the same source of uncertainty. And I'll give you an example here. So we have a different cash flow. The cash flow of this security is 5 in the upstate and 0 in the downstate, depending on whatever the probabilities are. Can you relate the price of this security to the state prices that you observe?